and American families getting their regular fix of news from all their favorite news channels. Of course, after a good few doses of international news, they're left paranoid and angry, contemplating as always the chaos that's just around the corner. From one part of the world, terror looms. The local news shows them a terror meter with the dial set to high. Even though their own town is so remote, it still holds an annual scarecrow festival. From another channel, the giant superpower that just keeps getting bigger covers the TV in a red mist. As for those Russians, well, they're always up to no good. News about North Korea has been somewhat quiet for a while, but one thing's for sure, thanks to family. Evil lurks in that secret state, and it's only a matter of time before the proverbial poo hits the fan. It's just a regular day in front of the TV, enough to raise someone's blood pressure. The Soviet Union is a thing of the past, but it's interesting if you look at how the Soviets depicted their enemy number one, the USA, of course, during the Cold War. While the US was talking about Reds under the bed and showing countless movies where it seemed every Russian character was innately evil, the Russians had their own creative lies about the Americans. Back in those days, there was the Soviet Union's Central Committee's Department of Agitation and Propaganda, and one thing it wouldn't allow was any mention of peace between the nations. If you were a journalist in Soviet Russia, going against this could have landed you in serious trouble. Still, many people did have a pro-American sentiment, just as in the US, many people didn't fear the beast from the east. Some people just saw a lot of gray areas rather than a good versus evil scenario. That kind of thought was suppressed as much as possible, and the Russians tried their best to stop any radio content coming through that might not mirror what the government told its citizens. Meanwhile, in the US, the government made sure people were aware of the Red Scare and possible communist takeover. In Russia, things were a little different. In movies and books, the KGB was not the baddie, the CIA was. And Britain's MI6 didn't come out looking too good either. Under Stalin, any kind of movie that was deemed not sufficiently patriotic was banned. And that went for a lot of music, too. Just like the American movies, if they wanted a villain, they chose an American. In fact, from the years 1946 to 1950, almost half of all the bad guys and girls in Soviet movies were American. In some films in the West, the Soviet forces were depicted as engaging in war crimes, but you could watch content about the same topic in a Soviet film and it would show the opposite being true. Still, it's said a lot of people watching those movies weren't exactly convinced. And there were Russians who still had some amount of admiration for American culture, a culture which by comparison was very free. After Stalin popped his clogs, things changed a bit. No longer was artistic content under strict guidance by the government, although movies still tried to depict Soviet life as wonderful and American life as not quite the wonderland it was advertised as being. That's old news, and the Cold War is over, although according to one analyst, the relationship between the two countries is still somewhat frosty. In fact, in 2018, The Atlantic asked, is China or Russia America's defining rival? So, is there still such a thing as anti-American propaganda in Russia? That's hard to say, but since Russia is such a powerful nation, it may have interests around the globe that don't exactly gel with American interests, so sure, there's some amount of conflict between the two countries. There's also the fact that Russia gave political asylum to Edward Snowden, a wanted man in the USA, a hero to some Americans and a criminal to others. I was very much a person the most powerful government in the world wanted to go away, Snowden once said about the country where he was born. Just last year, Russia granted him citizenship. What we're trying to say is, unlike the old days, there's no overt propaganda going on, although you're going to get two different takes on stories depending on which media you read. You won't hear these things said about the US and Russia right now, but they were commonplace in the past. Monopolies feed fascism on American soil. Myth of universal equality and equal opportunities for everyone in the US. Another favorite in the media back then was to talk about the decaying West or the rotting West, and at times you might have heard the degeneration of the West. Those terms might have fallen out of fashion, but only in 2017, after Russians were polled, 78% of them said the US meddles with Russian politics. On the other hand, when Americans were polled that same year, 68% of them believed Russia was meddling in American politics. 31% of Russians believed their government was meddling with US domestic affairs, while 55% of Americans said their government was meddling in Russian affairs. But did those Russians have a negative view of the USA? 76% did in fact have a negative view, and 81% said that the USA wanted to undermine Russia regarding the world stage. Still, a year later was the Russia-US summit in Helsinki, and that might have softened things a bit, especially with young Russians, because another poll said 57% of Russians aged 18 to 29 held a positive view of America. Even now, if you watch what might be called the state-sponsored Russian TV news, you'll most likely hear that anyone who opposes the Putin government is being paid by the US or in league with the US. So, while Facebook and Twitter release reports about Russian propaganda being purged from their respective platforms, Russian news is warning folks about how American propaganda infiltrates their country. In one documentary, a Russian official warned that the US was actively trying to create extremist groups in Russia to cause chaos. Politicians in the US have said exactly the same about Russia. Talking about Facebook, one thing it did to try and cut down on propaganda being disseminated by what it calls bad actors was to create more transparency around ads. Russia did a similar thing not too long ago, creating the Russian Foreign Agent Law. It's not so much about ad spending, but anyone receiving foreign donations will have to report it. This has led to summary raids and even Human Rights Watch coming under the radar. After that, Putin came up with the Russian Undesirable Organizations Law. This gives prosecutors the power to say that an organization is undesirable. In short, if you're found to be a threat to national security, you could end up in jail. And we all know how vague the term threat to national security is. As for movies, just in 2000 there was a Russian film released that had some amount of good versus bad in it. The Russians were good, of course. The movie, called Brother 2, had a hardcore Russian guy bringing down a corrupt American business tycoon. This wasn't blatantly showing Russians as the out-and-out good guys, similar to Rocky IV for the American side, but it tried to show that Russians believed in the strength of national identity more than mere money. It'd be hard these days for Russia to decry American-style consumerism and talk about cultural degeneration, because many of the leaders and business tycoons in the country are ridiculously rich and aren't shy about their fondness for luxury goods. The days of bashing consumerism are done, but Russia still pulls the "we're all in this together" card. Americans, on the other hand, might be depicted as more individualistic and so more capable of selfishness. So is there any anti-US sentiment in Russia now? Yes, is the answer, but it's not on the scale as it once was, and it seems a lot of young Russians don't buy into the fear. Okay, moving on to Asia, not North Korea, but China. We'll save the secret nation for last. Is there any anti-American sentiment in China, just as some Americans would have you believe that China is a threat that just keeps getting bigger? Anti-American sentiment goes back a long way. But let's skip communism because we touched on those days, and let's not bother with the notorious Mao Zedong. What about anti-Americanism as of late? Well, in 2011, 500,000 Chinese people responded to an online poll that asked them about the death of Osama bin Laden. 60% of them said it was a sad day, with some people saying bin Laden was an anti-US warrior. Others feared that after his death, the US would get tough on China. In short, much of this had to do with China's support of Pakistan and the fact that the Chinese government took a dim view of the US operations. To give you an idea of what some Chinese people thought, here's what one person wrote on a web forum. American logic is the logic of a gangster. Pakistan, you hold on. China is behind you. Another person wrote this. US politics of power and hegemony demonstrates that in order to serve its own interests, the US will achieve these by hook or crook, showing utter disregard for others. That's not something you'd hear on CNN. Okay, so you have that word hegemony, which relates to authority and domination. When we're talking about the sentiments of a powerful nation, there are always going to be some people who fear the big other. For Americans, China and Russia might be the big other, but that works both ways. Whether the media supports that outlook depends on which media you're reading. But for sure, there is some anti-American sentiment in China, just as there's anti-Chinese sentiment in some American media. Under the presidency of Donald Trump, things heated up a bit because he began a trade war with China. It was around this time that China started suddenly showing old Korean War films again. The US doesn't come out looking too good in those movies. One such movie that was recently aired was The Battle of Changling Mountain. That came out in 1956, but suddenly Chinese people were watching it again. The basic premise is evil imperialist Americans invade the Korean peninsula because that's what good-for-nothing evil empires do. The big-nosed American troops, you won't be surprised to hear, are defeated by the Chinese. Newspapers in China were also quick to remind people about the general badness of the USA, as seen in the movie. The general message is the USA will do anything to stop the rise of China. The imperialists want to remain imperial. This is how a Chinese blogger put it. On the surface, this is a trade war. However, it's actually a larger battle to protect life and death of new China. We should also remind you that China, like the USA, is a diverse country, and of course not all people share this opinion. Some people wrote that the US is behind the pandemic. Others call America a country of outlandish behavior and shaky morals, and a lot of crime. As the trade war was going on, China's Culture and Tourism Ministry started putting out fresh travel warnings about the rampant theft and shooting in the US. Like Russia has done, China at times paints a picture which exposes the underbelly of America, as if everyone walks around with a gun and a bad attitude and respects nothing but themselves. The Chinese theme, on the other hand, is everyone working together like honeybees in a hive. There's also the fact that China didn't censor the Tarantino movie Django Unchained, which was very unusual given the graphic violence and China's heavy-handed censors. It's thought that the reason China left it alone was to show citizens that America was a brutal place where rich white men oppressed minorities. We're not sure if China shows movies about its own history of brutal slavery. We're sure there's a lot of anti-American sentiment among the Chinese people, but then every country has a section of bitter, flag-waving folks who have chosen to dislike other cultures without much thought. That's exactly why most Americans were gung-ho about invading Iraq, and it's why some Chinese will see Americans as the epitome of evil. These people are often the minority, though, and most folks are way more discerning about who they dislike. We must not think everyone thinks a certain way or we are victims of propaganda. Do you remember when the late, great Anthony Bourdain went to Iran? He said he met the warmest people there he'd ever met after traveling the globe. TV in America had led him to believe Iranians hated Americans. That wasn't true, in spite of crippling sanctions and the fact that the Brits and Americans installed a dictator there in the past so they could steal the oil. But if there's any country in the world where America's at the forefront of the axis of evil, it's in North Korea. A country where Americans are depicted as ravenous, pot-bellied, big-nosed capitalists that'll eat your children and drop bombs on your grandparents, all because you won't open a McDonald's on every street corner. The ugly Americans have been a thing in North Korea for a long time, especially after American troops were accused of committing war crimes and massacring innocent civilians during the Korean War. We're talking women and children here, and the women were often used by servicemen before they were executed. Even though you mainly hear that in the North, there's still a fair bit of anti-Americanism in the South. Just look at the South soaps and movies. Like many countries in Asia, the white man is often depicted as a brute, especially if he's American. North Korea says those massacres included 35,000 people, although this is disputed. That many people may have died, but it's not ever been fully understood who is behind the massacre. Was it South Koreans or was it ordered by the Americans? It's still a mystery, but for sure terrible things happened, and the US Army has committed other war crimes in Korea. That's the reason when school kids are taught that US soldiers hammered nails into victims' heads and sliced off women's breasts, they might believe it. In no other country is America depicted as such an evil place. The country is the antithesis of everything that's good in the world, according to North Korea propaganda. To North Koreans, only one thing matters to Americans, and that's money. They worship money and will do anything it takes to get more. You can see posters in the country that show American servicemen putting bullets in children's heads. You'll also see North Korean soldiers easily overpowering American soldiers. If you watch TV in North Korea, you'll have to watch a lot of government broadcasts and be told time and again how happy you are. Like Stalinist Russia, there will be lots of clapping going on. If you read news, you'll see phrases such as imperialist American invaders and bloodthirsty, murderous American imperialists. Basically, Americans are depicted as savages. The problem is, North Koreans can't exactly access history books or online resources. They can find North Korean websites which often blame the world's woes on the US and talk about how North Korea is a principled or even perfect culture. You can visit some North Korean websites today and there's no shortage of stories talking about blessed people. But as we scanned the latest news, we didn't see any explicit anti-US propaganda. Nonetheless, go to the movie websites and you'll find your fair share of movies showing Americans as evil capitalists, such as the classic Nameless Heroes. Look a little bit further and you could find stories right now that talk about North Korea's victories against global imperialism and the many sanctions by the hostile foreign forces. You can read about how in the past the US used horrifying biological weapons against North Koreans, although these days it seems the country has calmed down somewhat with his anti-American message. In 2018, North Korea even canceled its hugely popular anti-US imperialism march. As of late, it's reported that the country doesn't push too hard in regards to calling the US a rotten, diseased pirate nation. Still, sketches of missiles hitting the US capital continue to exist, and you'll regularly hear about how the US is hurting North Korea, which is partly true given the harsh sanctions imposed on the country. You can also go to the online bookshop and find classics, such as The US Imperialists Started the Korean War and the 2003 book US, The Empire of Terrorism. If North Koreans have read those, we imagine some of them see the USA as the big bad wolf that at any time could come and blow their house down. Still, over the last couple of years, anti-American propaganda posters have been taken down in capital city Pyongyang. Defectors have said that when they were in North Korea, the USA was painted as the mortal enemy, and as one young man put it, basically an evil being. That same guy said he was taught to believe all Americans had hideous huge noses and scary-looking eyes. This is Propaganda 101. Make your enemy look inhuman. Most nations have done it. The defector and others were taught in kindergarten that this evil must be smashed, and they even sang songs about it. He also said that when school sports day came around, one of the games was to run at a dummy dressed up as an American soldier, stab it, and run back. They enjoyed it too, since they'd grown up seeing posters of American soldiers hammering nails in helpless women's heads. One guy said he was told in school that US troops took the unborn babies out of mothers and gave them to hungry dogs. Some guys interviewed said when living in North Korea, they had no doubt at all their own army was stronger than the USA's, and if a war should happen, North Korea would be the winning side. One guy said he was surprised when he got to South Korea and the Americans he met were friendly and joked a lot. It was nothing like he'd learned in school. Although another guy said that while his beliefs changed, he was surprised about the US's high crime and gun violence, and also the conflict of races. He was actually scared when he became embroiled in that since he was Asian. In fact, another guy visited the US, and after watching news every day, he was petrified that he might get shot. Still, he enjoyed his freedom. So to end this, you'll meet Russian and Chinese people with very diverse opinions about the US, and you'll meet Americans with diverse opinions about those countries. But the problem with North Korea is that it's very hard to get access to people's real opinions. It's very likely that they harbor a lot of negative feelings toward the US. Now you need to watch What Is It Really Like Living in North Korea? Or have a look at The Real Reason Why China Wants to Expand.